Welcome to Slumber Darkly, where we explore true stories that plunge into the depths of human darkness. Stories that linger long after you've heard them. Tonight, we take you back to the bustling streets of 1940s Los Angeles, a city teeming with life, but hiding a shadowy underworld of violence and despair. This is the story of Otto Stephen Wilson, a man whose name would forever be associated with blood and terror. Known as the LA Ripper, Wilson's gruesome crimes shocked a city already accustomed to violence, leaving a trail of horror that would haunt Los Angeles for years to come. Settle in as we unravel the tale of a man driven by unspeakable urges, a tale that is as disturbing as it is unforgettable. It was November 14th, 1944, a typical evening in downtown Los Angeles. The war years had transformed the city into a bustling metropolis, with servicemen on leave, mingling with Hollywood hopefuls and everyday citizens. The neon lights flickered over Main Street as people crowded into bars, seeking escape from the daily grind. Among them was 26-year-old Virginia Lee Griffin, known to her friends as Virgie. She was married, but with her husband, Homer Griffin, often away on trucking jobs, Virgie liked to enjoy herself in his absence. That night, as she sat in a bar on Main Street, she noticed a dark-haired stranger across the room. He smiled at her, and she smiled back. Soon, they were deep in conversation. As the night wore on, the stranger suggested they move to a more private location. The two made their way to the Barclay Hotel, a once grand establishment that had seen better days. They registered under the names Mr. and Mrs. O.S. Wilson of Steubenville, Indiana. Once in the room, they continued to drink, the alcohol loosening their inhibitions. But the stranger, Otto Stephen Wilson, had other plans. He excused himself, saying he was going out to buy whiskey. As he walked the streets, he passed a hardware store and noticed a large carving knife displayed in the window. Without hesitation, he entered the store and purchased the knife, wrapping it carefully in paper before heading back to the hotel. Back in the room, Wilson placed the package on the dresser and the whiskey on the table. They continued drinking, but the mood quickly soured. An argument broke out. Virgie demanded an extra $20 for her services, a demand that pushed Wilson over the edge. In a sudden fit of rage, he struck her in the mouth, knocking her onto the bed. The impact left her stunned, and before she could react, Wilson began to choke her. His hands tightened around her throat until she lost consciousness. But this was just the beginning. In a frenzied state, Wilson dragged Virgie's body to a large closet in the room. The knife, still wrapped in paper, was now in his hand. What followed was an act of unimaginable brutality. Wilson slashed her torso from throat to pelvis, pulling out her entrails and laying them beside her. His anger and bloodlust seemed insatiable as he cut off her breasts, partially severed an arm, and dismembered one of her legs. He attempted to dispose of the leg by grinding it in the room's disposal unit, but the machine quickly clogged with human flesh, forcing him to abandon the effort. After completing the gruesome act, Wilson calmly washed his hands, dressed, and prepared to leave. Before exiting, he left the knife next to Virgie's mutilated body, as if leaving a signature at the scene of his crime. As he walked out the next morning, he handed $1 to the maid, Eva Dunn, with a polite smile and the words, "Please don't disturb my wife." With no sense of remorse, Wilson made his way to the $1 Million Theater, where he bought a ticket to see The Walking Dead, a horror film starring Boris Karloff. Sitting in the dark theater, he felt an eerie thrill knowing that he had just committed a heinous murder, all while those around him were unaware of the blood on his hands. The movie was a brief respite for Wilson, a moment to revel in his anonymity before the kill lust, as he later described it, returned. When the film ended, Wilson left the theater and wandered into another bar on South Hill Street. There, he ordered a glass of wine and began watching a woman seated at the bar. Her name was Lillian Johnson, though she was also known by her working name, Betty Cook. Lillian, a 38-year-old prostitute, was also married, but like Virgie, she wasn't shy about making extra money when her husband was away. Wilson struck up a conversation with her, and before long, they decided to rent a room at the Joyce Hotel, located nearby on South Hill Street. They registered under the names Mr. and Mrs. O.S. Watson. Once inside the room, Wilson's dark urges resurfaced. As Lillian began to undress, Wilson struck her with sudden violence, knocking her to the floor. He choked her until she stopped breathing, but this time, he wasn't content with just killing. Moving to the wash basin, he calmly lathered his face and shaved with a straight razor. With the same razor, he then returned to Lillian's lifeless body and began mutilating her in a manner that mirrored his earlier crime. He slashed her chest to her pelvis, bit her throat and breasts, and even severed one of her nipples with his teeth. He cut his own hand in the process, but that didn't deter him. He lingered in the room, savoring the violence he had inflicted, before finally deciding to leave. Before exiting, he stopped to speak with the desk clerk, saying, "My wife is sleeping. Please don't disturb her." While Wilson moved freely through the city, the bodies of his victims lay undiscovered. It wasn't until 2 p.m. that day that a maid at the Barclay Hotel entered the room where Virgie had been murdered. The sight was so gruesome that she immediately called the police, who quickly secured the crime scene. Just an hour and a half later, officers were responding to a second murder at the Joyce Hotel, where Lillian Johnson's mutilated body had been found. Both hotels were in shock, and the LAPD wasted no time in setting up a dragnet around a 20-block area, determined to capture the sadistic murderer. Meanwhile, Wilson had made his way to yet another bar, this time the Red Front Bar on South Hill Street, just a short distance from the Joyce Hotel. It was there, at around 5:30 p.m., that LAPD patrolman Harry Donlin entered the establishment, following up on a description of the suspect. Donlin noticed a man fitting the description provided by witnesses. Dark-haired, with cuts on his hands, sitting at the bar, casually drinking wine and chatting with a young woman. Sensing something was off, Donlin approached the man and decided to arrest him on suspicion of robbery. As he searched the suspect, Donlin found a box of matches from the Barclay Hotel in his pocket, and with that, he knew he had the LA Ripper in custody. Wilson was taken to the Central Jail, where he was interrogated by LAPD detectives Stuart Jones, R.F. McGarry, and Harry Hansen. For the first 2 hours, Wilson denied everything. He claimed not to know Lillian Johnson, even when shown her photograph. But outside the interrogation room, tensions were high. Homer Griffin, the husband of the first victim, was heard shouting to the police, "Leave me alone with that guy for 5 minutes, and I'll save the state a lot of money." Eventually, Wilson's resistance began to crumble. As officers prepared to take him back to the Barclay Hotel, where Virginia Griffin had been murdered, Wilson finally broke down. He confessed to LAPD Detective R.F. McGarry while sitting in a patrol car outside the police station. "A kind of craze had gotten a hold of me," he explained. "I don't know just how to explain it. I sort of got a thrill every time I thought about the murder." Wilson described in chilling detail how he had watched the movie starring Boris Karloff after killing Virginia Griffin, feeling an eerie sense of power, knowing that no one around him suspected what he had done. He explained how the kill lust returned after the movie, leading him to the bar where he met Lillian Johnson. He recounted the events of her murder with a disturbing lack of emotion. "We didn't have any trouble at all. I hit her with my fist, then I cut her up with a razor blade, washed, and left." The confession, recorded on sound discs by LAPD technician Ray Pinker, left no doubt as to Wilson's guilt. But the investigation didn't stop there. Wilson was examined by Dr. Joseph Paul DeRiver, a criminal psychiatrist with the LAPD, who sought to understand the forces driving Wilson's actions. Dr. DeRiver's interviews with Wilson revealed a man deeply troubled by his past, his sexual identity, and his relationships with women. Wilson spoke of his childhood, spent mostly in an orphanage, where he was placed at a young age and spent most of his formative years isolated from the warmth of a family. His mother had placed him and his siblings in the orphanage, visiting only rarely, and his father was an almost complete stranger. This early abandonment seemed to have shaped Wilson's psyche, leaving him with deep-seated feelings of resentment and a desperate need to assert control over others. Feelings that would later manifest in his horrific crimes. Dr. Joseph Paul DeRiver's probing questions aimed to uncover the roots of Wilson's sadistic tendencies. Wilson admitted that his violent urges had been with him for years, growing stronger and harder to suppress as time went on. He spoke openly about his early sexual experiences, which were marked by confusion and deviance. Wilson revealed that he had engaged in homosexual activities during his youth, but had later turned his attention to women, driven by a compulsive need to dominate and destroy. His marriage, far from providing stability, had been fraught with violence. He confessed to threatening his wife with a knife and cutting her during arguments, though he insisted that he never intended to kill her. As the interviews continued, Dr. DeRiver noted that Wilson's most disturbing trait was his lack of remorse. Wilson described his crimes with a chilling detachment, as though he were recounting a routine event, rather than the brutal murders of two women. When asked why he had committed such heinous acts, Wilson struggled to articulate a clear motive. He spoke of a kill lust that overtook him, a force that seemed to come from outside himself and drove him to commit acts of unspeakable violence. He admitted that he felt a sense of pleasure from seeing blood and cutting flesh, but this satisfaction was fleeting, leaving him empty and craving more. Dr. DeRiver's report to the police concluded that Wilson was a necrophiliac with cannibalistic tendencies, driven by a sadomasochistic complex that made him a danger to society. Despite these findings, it was clear that Wilson was fully aware of the difference between right and wrong. He knew that what he had done was wrong, but his compulsion was so strong that he felt powerless to resist it. Alcohol, which Wilson had used to numb his feelings and suppress his urges, ultimately became the catalyst for his violent outbursts. The trial of Otto Stephen Wilson began on June 18, 1945, in Los Angeles, with Superior Judge Edward R. Brand presiding. The courtroom was packed with spectators eager to see justice served for the LA Ripper. The prosecution, led by Chief Deputy District Attorney Herbert V. Walker, presented a strong case against Wilson. They had his confession, recorded in chilling detail, as well as the physical evidence, his fingerprints at the crime scenes, the knife he used, and the testimonies of hotel staff who had seen him with the victims. Wilson's defense team, led by Deputy Public Defender William Neely, faced an uphill battle. They argued that Wilson's mental state should be considered, hoping to avoid the death penalty by portraying him as a man driven by uncontrollable urges, rather than a cold-blooded killer. They called several defense psychiatrists to testify, including Dr. Glenn Myers and Dr. Victor Parkin, who both argued that Wilson was insane at the time of the murders. Dr. Parkin described Wilson as being in a semi-automatic state during the killings, suggesting that he was not fully aware of his actions. However, the prosecution countered with their own expert witnesses. Dr. R.O. Llewellyn and Dr. Charles Sisson, both psychiatrists, testified that while Wilson was a sexual psychopath, he was legally sane and fully aware of his actions. Dr. Joseph Paul DeRiver, whose interviews with Wilson had revealed the depths of his sadism, also testified that Wilson knew exactly what he was doing when he committed the murders. On June 27, 1945, after hearing all the evidence and testimonies, the jury of 8 women and 4 men retired to deliberate. The case had been laid out in stark detail, and it didn't take long for them to reach a verdict. The next day, the jury found Otto Stephen Wilson sane and guilty of the first-degree murders of Virginia Griffin and Lillian Johnson. The death penalty was swiftly handed down, and Wilson was sentenced to die in the gas chamber at San Quentin. The speed with which justice was served reflected the severity of Wilson's crimes. Los Angeles, a city accustomed to crime and vice, had been horrified by the brutality of the LA Ripper. Wilson's acts were so grotesque, so far beyond the pale, that there was little room for sympathy or leniency. His execution was seen as a necessary step to ensure that no one else would fall victim to his uncontrollable bloodlust. On July 13th, 1945, Wilson was transported to San Quentin State Prison, where he awaited his execution. The atmosphere in the prison was tense. Wilson's crimes had made headlines across the country, and his impending execution was a matter of public interest. Despite his detailed confessions and the overwhelming evidence against him, Wilson remained a figure of both fear and fascination. His calm demeanor, even in the face of death, only added to the sense of unease surrounding his case. Wilson's time in prison was short. On September 20th, 1945, just a few months after his conviction, Otto Stephen Wilson was executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin. The process was swift and methodical, as the state of California sought to bring an end to the life of a man who had terrorized its citizens. The California Supreme Court later affirmed Wilson's conviction, noting that 4 of the 6 psychiatrists who examined him had found him legally sane. With Wilson's death, the chapter of the LA Ripper came to a close, but the scars he left on the city would linger for years to come. The story of Otto Stephen Wilson, the LA Ripper, is a haunting reminder of the darkness that can reside within the human soul. A man who seemed to live a relatively ordinary life, a dishwasher in Pasadena, moving from one cheap hotel to another, was capable of unleashing horrors that defy comprehension. His case raises unsettling questions about the nature of evil and the thin line that separates sanity from madness. Wilson's crimes were not just acts of violence. They were expressions of a deep-seated need for control, a desire to dominate and destroy that he could not or would not resist. His story serves as a stark reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often those who hide in plain sight, blending in with society until their darker urges drive them to unspeakable acts. As you drift off to sleep tonight, consider the shadows that lurk in the most unexpected places, the hidden corners of the human mind where the darkest desires reside. The story of the LA Ripper is one that stays with you, a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers are those we cannot see until it is too late. Thank you for joining us tonight on this unsettling journey into one of the darkest chapters of Los Angeles history. Here at Slumber Darkly, we delve into these stories not only to intrigue, but to remind us of the importance of understanding the complexities of the human mind. Sometimes, the monsters we fear are not creatures of fiction, but are very real, hiding behind the masks of everyday life. As you prepare to close your eyes, remember to lock your doors, Check your windows and keep those you love close. The world is full of mysteries, and not all of them are far away. Until next time, sleep well.